Okay, hello everyone, this is CounterYolo, bringing you another video in Star Trek Online after a little bit of a break. And in today's video, I'm going to be ranking all the science vessels inside of the game in my own subjective tier list for this. I previously was going to try to do all of like the 300 ships in the game at once, but it turned out that when I tried to record that video, it was longer than what YouTube allowed me to upload. So I had to go back to the drawing board and making 3 separate videos, which means that some of the ships that I originally had for different tiers, because of my own bell curve for how things were, actually ended up in different spots. So I had to not only reduce some of the ordering, but also change things so that it made sense for where certain things were in terms of tiers. But anyway, I will go over my biases and limitations to start off with, and then I'll go over all those tier 6 starships inside the game, going from best to worst. I was initially going to do worst to best, but then when I initially started recording, like the first time before I did super long, I realized that I was referencing so many of the better starships in the game when I was going from worst to best that I was like, nah, I think it's gonna make the most sense if we go from best to worst. Even though technically, from a YouTube standpoint, I understand that for like view time, it would make more sense to go worst to best, but I'm trying to do what makes the most sense from a discussion standpoint. So I'm going to go from best to worst. A TLDR will show up on Reddit eventually. Keep in mind, because ST Reddit guidelines says that I can only do 2 posts a week that go directly to my YouTube channel. I won't be able to put all 3 parts during 1 week. And because of that, I'm probably going to put part 3 of my subjective tier list stuff probably next week as well, just so that it's not as disjointed on there as well. But TLDR won't be finished until I finish all of the parts here. This was a little bit of a process when I was going from 1 video to 3, just because I wanted a bell curve for each video instead of just my plain bell curve I had for all 300. Because some videos like this one ended up actually having ships having to go lower on their tiers, because actually a lot of the science vessels are actually fine. But from a bell curve standpoint, I had to basically deflate some of these ships in order to make the bell curve work. Anyway, see the time links in the description or at the time bar at the bottom of the screen if you're not interested in some of my discussions on certain ships and want to skip around to wherever your favorite ship is. All right, with that being said, I do have some biases that I have to cover before we get into the list itself. First off, I am going to be valuing these just on PvE playstyles. PvP is so volatile that I will not be considering that. Also keep in mind that pilot abilities and intel abilities are much stronger in PvP than in PvE. As a result, those ships are going to be much lower on this list. Additionally, I am a tank captain. So as a result of that, ships that are going to be good for tanking are going to be inflated on this list. As much as I'm trying to stay as unbiased as I can, I'm a tank captain. That bias is going to come through. Additionally, in terms of playstyles, I'm going to be valuing flexibility over just being the absolute best in one particular playstyle. It doesn't mean the one-trick ponies can't be higher on the list. It's just that, I mean, if a starship can do basically every playstyle, that's going to rank higher than maybe a starship that can only do one playstyle, but can do that playstyle the best of every other starship in the game. Okay? All right. And as a result of that, this is not going to be a list that is just, hey, here's the best DPS science vessel to the worst DPS science vessel. That's not how this list is going to work. In terms of specializations, as a result of this stuff that I've just said, for full specialization stuff, I value command the absolute highest because thanks to some buffs in the command abilities, it is basically the meta for both torpedo builds and for tank builds. Because it's basically the best for 2 different builds, I basically have to rank it the highest. After them, Temporal and Miracle Worker are basically just about neck and neck. Temporal is flexible for all playstyles. However, Commander Miracle Worker is still really, really strong as well. Science doesn't necessarily get the many of the good abilities in Miracle Worker versus like energy-based builds and kinetic-based builds, but an extra clicky console in an exotic build is still valuable. So there's nothing wrong there in my opinion. And then from there, I value pilot over intel for full specialization, just because pilot at least gets pilot maneuvers at commander pilot. Intel's funds specialization stuff at commander rank just isn't that meaningful in current Star Trek Online. Stuff blows up too quickly in elite content nowadays, and a lot of the other stuff in Intel is either lackluster or is inconsistent across various commander Intel starships. Not all starships that are commander Intel even get a cloak. And it's something that Cryptic really needs to look into. Cryptic really needs above commander Intel. Because of that, when I am ranking these starships, I view commander Intel this as strong as if it was a lieutenant commander Intel when I'm looking at these starships. So whenever you're going through this list, that is my personal bias behind Intel. That being said, for partial specializations, I still value Commander Intel or Lieutenant Commander Intel above Lieutenant Commander Pilot, because for me, pretty much pilot is only really fun for the pilot maneuvers. If it doesn't have pilot maneuvers, I'm not really the biggest fan of the pilot abilities. There are some niche situations where pilot is fine in PvE, but those are, again, very niche scenarios, and we will get to those whenever we get to cruisers, because that's where I feel it really gets the most benefit. And digitally for partial specialization stuff, this is where I have temporal above Miracle Worker, because unlike full specialization, Miracle Worker doesn't really get that huge of a value for exotic base builds, while temporal is basically valuable for any type of build, pretty much regardless of where the partial specialization is. Granted, if we're looking at that list of partial specialization, if we go down to Ensign of all 5, Command then gets really weak, but there are so few Ensign Command starships that I'm not even going to bother worrying about that. In terms of other limitations and considerations, again, when we're looking at these starships, I'm looking at playstyle only. This means I am not valuing the starships based upon what they give you. I'm valuing the starships based upon how good they would be to fly. This means if you're like thinking about the starship because of just a particular starship trait that you're getting from the ship, that is not going to be considered for this list. Additionally, if you're trying to get a starship because you're running a particular pet or a particular console that the ship gives you for another build, that also will not be considered. I will only be talking about pets and consoles in this list if that pet or console is restricted to that starship or a specific group of starships or a specific subclass, like for instance flight deck carriers, and if that pet or console is strong themselves. In terms of pets, I'm going to be comparing them to the Styx Terran Dreadnought cruisers, Terran frigates. If the pets are strong enough to be contenders versus those frigates, then I will consider them for this video. Additionally, for consoles, if it's a console that is in the same realm of strength as the DPRM, then I will also consider it. Keep in mind that there aren't that many consoles that really are in that same realm that are restricted to specific starships. So you will not see very many starships with unique consoles in this list. There are some, but it is very, very few. Anyway, as for playstyle elements that I will be considering for like the jack of all trades types of things, I'm going to see if it can do energy damage, torpedo damage, or kinetic damage, exotic damage, whether it can tank, which is a little bit more tongue and loose in terms of whether it's something can. I am a tank captain, so I could basically tell you that, along with extras like, does it have hangar bays? Can it cloak? Does it have radar flanking? Obviously, you can't have all these things because we don't have any ships at the moment that have radar flanking and a hangar bay. So you aren't going to be able to have everything in this list. Also keep in mind for torpedo damage, if a starship does not have concentrated firepower 3, I am not going to say it will be able to do torpedo DPS. It can do side torp still, but not torpedo DPS. For energy damage, if it doesn't have at least 7 weapons on the starship, I'm going to say that you probably shouldn't be doing energy damage with the ship. And for exotic damage, for the other lists in particular, I'm going to be looking at whether it has 6 total science abilities and at least a lieutenant commander seat. just because, I mean, for science vessels, we're going to have secondary deflectors for nearly all of our subclasses. But if you're trying to do exotic damage on a cruiser or an exort, even though it's not meta, we will be talking about that in terms of at least the jack of all trades starships. With that being said, here are my subclass biases for the 3 different classes. We will be talking about escorts and cruisers in their own separate videos, so I won't really talk about them here. In terms of our science vessels, science dreadnoughts, science destroyers, and scout ships are all really good in their own ways. Unfortunately, science dreadnoughts have been severely neglected. We haven't gotten a new one since Victory's Life came out, and that was a C-Store starship, so it was obviously supposed to be weaker. And like every single freaking science dreadnought has intel as their highest specialization. It'd be nice to have a science dreadnought added to the game that wasn't intel. But I mean, we've been waiting 3 years for a new science dreadnought. I don't know when we're going to get the next one. That's why I'm hoping the next that's why I'm hoping the Gemini Vanguard flagship that's coming out hopefully soon is a science dreadnought, so that it can use the flagship set, and it also gets rid of the drought of science dreadnoughts that we've had for 3 years now, which is bigger than like any other subclass inside the game. Beyond them, we have science destroyers and scout ships. From a mechanical standpoint, science destroyers have the most potential, but they are only really good if you have that commander and lieutenant commander seat that are able to flip, have your specializations on them. If your specialization stuff is on other seats, then they just aren't as strong as other subclasses. And scout ships are there because they're the only science vessel with actually a good mastery package. 4 of them have like the exact same mastery package, and then you have scout ships which have a better one, and then science carriers have the worst one by far. After them, we have multi-mission science vessels and science spearheads, which are frankly science dreadnoughts, but they're missing something. Multi-mission science vessels are missing a weapon over science dreadnoughts, and science spearheads are just science dreadnoughts that are missing a hangar bay. And then below them, we have science vessels, and then we have science carriers way below them, because science carriers lose a secondary deflector. In terms of changes from my Starship Classes Re-Explained video from March of 2020, we haven't had any new subclasses for science vessels added to the game. However, as a result of this video and the other 2 videos that'll be coming out soon, I did do a carrier reclassification, and I got rid of my engineering carrier subclass for the cruisers. That was because we added multi-mission cruisers inside the game, and to me, that engineering carrier subclass just didn't make sense anymore. So I split out the carriers that were in that subclass into the other 3 carrier subclasses. As a result, the Vorgon carrier has been placed into the science carrier subclass for the purposes of this video, even though it is commander engineering. Some of you may disagree with that, but I mean, science carriers just suck in general. So for me, it made the most sense to put it there. If you want to disagree with me and think it should be a dreadnought carrier, you're more than welcome to disagree with me in the comments. As for new starships in general, I've got that chart there at the bottom of the screen just to show you like the percentages from old to new in terms of where science vessels ended up. And in that, we've gotten 3 new science vessels, 4 new in the science spearhead destroyer category, 2 science destroyers, 2 science spearheads, and then 5 new science carriers plus that 1 Vorgon carrier was a reclassification to be added to the list. That's why, if you're looking at the chart itself, that's why there is this asterisk here in those spots, because it's saying that, yeah, this is technically 1 higher than technically what you would typically see in Cryptic's official listings of these starships. So as a result, in this tier list, we're going to have 60 starships to go through. So just keep that in mind. And here are all 60 here with their subclasses. We also will have a TLDR at the end of the video that's going to go through like every single tier of where these starships lie. So you can feel free to wait, or you can just skip to the end and then start watching the video from here again later. It's totally up to you. And we'll go through just the main class itself and then every single subclass, and then we'll go into the actual ships themselves. Let's start off with, because of HP inflation inside of the game, the science vessel class is actually not as low on hull as it used to be. but it is still lower. And if you look at the average stats here, they have higher shields than the other subclasses, but they're lower on average than everything else. Lower on hold, turning, impulse, inertia, everything. And they also have one weapon less typically. Their one thing going for them is a secondary deflector, which means, you know, if your subclass doesn't happen to have a secondary deflector in the science vessel class, it's going to be a significant hindrance to you. Additionally, 4 of the 6 subclasses do not have any difference in their mastery package. So that's another big downside for them, and it really blends a lot of the subclasses together. I do hope at some point in the near future that Cryptic does adjust that and give more offensive mastery packages to like science destroyers, science dreadnoughts, stuff like that, because it'd be nice to have some variety in there, frankly. Looking at science vessels, generally speaking, their big weakness is that they're just 6 weapon starships that are pretty much just worse scout ships. That's really their big downside. They're inconsistent on their access to dual cannons, and they don't have the flexibility of scout ships. They don't have the better mastery package of scout ships. They don't have access to raider flanking that scout ships have. Granted, raider flanking doesn't really affect most abilities, but it does affect some exotic abilities. They are still decent maneuverable still, and frankly, just because most science vessels are in the science vessel subclass, yes, I know that is confusing. I wish there was different ways to call them, but that's how Cryptic calls them. It is what it is. When it comes to scout ships, obviously we only have 3 full stat of these in the game right now. They're all good. There's nothing wrong with them. I think like the lowest one's technically B tier in my list. Like they're all very good. Again, what's happening here is we're replacing some survival with accuracy and crit severity. Obviously, crit severity is the big important part of this. This is as the only scout ship that gets crit severity, and it's as the only science vessel that gets crit severity in its master package. That does help quite a bit, because there is the particle manipulator on space trait that you will. It's basically best in slot for space traits. That basically gives you 50% crit chance. So if 50% crit chance on exotic abilities plus the other stuff you're stacking on exotic boats nowadays, an extra 15% crit severity is going to make a big difference. It's just what it is. They also have extras that scout ships or science vessels don't have. So they are really good. Yes, they are really low on durability technically, but you also have some science vessels that are about as bad in terms of durability as scout ships. So it's not really the end of the world. As you notice here, their inertia is always 80, which is interesting. I wonder if we're going to get some differences later on down the line. And we only have 1 scout ship that is full spec. Nonetheless, they are still very strong, very flexible. You really can't go wrong with scout ships unless you're going to tank, and that's the one thing that hurts them. For multiple science vessels, what you're gaining with these ships is you're gaining guaranteed access to dual cannons, and you get a hangar bay, but you end up losing a lot of that maneuverability that regular science vessels have. So that's a slight downside. It's not that huge of a deal, because besides the Sphere Builder multi-mission, like all of them have like 11.5 turning anyway, so it's not that huge of a deal, frankly. And they're also reasonably durable too. Now, obviously, when we're comparing to subclass to subclass, these are still just science dreadnoughts without an extra weapon, which feels bad, but I mean, the most potent science vessels in general are all pretty decent, so it's not really the end of the world, in my opinion. Of course, we have science dreadnoughts, which, I mean, they're technically, from a base class theoretical standpoint, they are one of our best science vessels in the game. They have 7 base weapons, and they have a hangar bay. However, because the subclass has been neglected for so long, we have had some pretty significant HP inflation and shield inflation in terms of science vessels inside the game. As a result, they aren't as remarkable as they were even last time whenever I talked about this subclass. So because of that, they aren't going to rate as highly in this list as what you might expect them to. Also keep in mind, as I've probably granted in this video already, every single science dreadnought's highest specialization seat is intelligence. There's like no variety here between the different ones, besides like just where is that intelligence seat showing up? Is it going to be on the commander seat, a lieutenant commander seat? And again, as I've said in my rating system here, the difference between commander intel and lieutenant commander intel is so insignificant that I just am rating them the exact same. So, yes, they have horrible maneuverability, but that's to be expected. They are fine ships, but they aren't big standouts, frankly. And then, of course, we have the science destroyers and science spearheads. Again, because of HP inflation and other things going on in this game, as you're looking at the average stats, on average, they are more durable and more maneuverable than the average science vessel. And they have 7 base weapons. So yeah, even though they aren't getting the extra hangar bay of science dreadnoughts, generally speaking, these are really, really strong platforms. And because these aren't neglected like science dreadnoughts, a lot of your better science vessels are going to show up here. It's just the way that it is. Additionally, if you have a science destroyer, you can have tactical mode, which for most science destroyers is something that you should not be using. However, there was one brand new science destroyer that came out recently that is ridiculously good because of tactical mode. It's super good for like all torpedo builds and tanking builds. That it's going to be very, very high in this list. Overall, I really love this subclass in general. But then again, if you don't have a science destroyer and only have a science spearhead, spearheads are basically a science dreadnoughts without that hangar bay, but you have a more maneuverable platform to compensate for it. So I think it's okay. It's not really the end of the world. And of course, we get last and certainly least with science carriers, which, sure, they are the most durable science subclass, but these are basically multi-mission science vessels that get an extra hangar bay, but lose their secondary deflector in compensation. That is not a worthwhile trade. Not in the slightest. Sure, they've got really high stats, but I am not a fan. Sure, they have high hull and they're low in everything else. And the master package, if you're comparing to the other stuff here, they lose the exotic damage amp from the mastery package. I mean, like, when push comes to shove, like, it's almost like saying, oh yeah, we're gonna like make your subclass so terrible that you probably shouldn't be doing exotic damage on them, but at the same time, we're not going to give you any damage amp whatsoever either. So it's like, if you aren't trying to tank on these things, it's going to suck. But even if you try to tank on these things, there are better options in the game to do so. So I'm not a fan. I'm not really a fan whatsoever. And as a result, in this tier list, I refuse to put any science carriers above a D tier, frankly, because I don't feel any of the science carriers are worth mentioning in even average. They have to be below average. There are some that have niche stuff that's cool, but they're not ships that I recommend at all. So there is that. And again, for this tier list, I am doing a rough bill curve. I did technically pull some ships out of C tier just because I wanted some of the tiers to make more sense. And so B tier and D tier have a little bit more ships than what you would probably expect from what should even be a bell curve that I've modified here. And S tier will just be one ship, and F tier will just be one ship. Again, S tier is not necessarily the best ship in the game for science, but it's the best jack of all trades starship. So basically, if you want to do basically any playstyle in the game, that's a ship that I would recommend. Today's video is more of a sequel to the Starship Classes re-explain video and the best tanks in Star Trek Online video. This plus the next two videos on the channel. If you're wanting builds, or if you're wanting like my actual opinions about what's the best ships to pick based upon not just performance, but also the extra other stuff you're getting like traits and consoles, there are plenty of other videos on the channel. like the best lockbox of promo starships, best low buy store starships, and best coupon token starships videos if you're curious about that. And of course, if you're newer to Star Trek Online, my Budget Builds 2020 edition video is still perfectly great to look at. The only thing to add there for anything for builds is that there's the Fecalari engine in a tactical slot for your exotic builds. Besides that console, that video is still perfectly up to date, frankly. All right. With all of that, let's get into the tier list itself. And of course, we're going to be starting with S tier. And again, this has to be a starship that can do energy damage, kinetic damage, exotic damage, and has to be able to tank really, really well, ideally in as many playstyles as possible. Which means for every S tier starship in this video and in the next two videos, the S tier starship must have Lieutenant Commander command in its seating, because in order to do kinetic damage, in my opinion, you need Concentrate Firepower 3. With that said, there really is only one starship here that makes sense, and that is the Courage class. I went goo goo gaga over this starship for tanking whenever the Courage stats were released a little while ago. It also is a decently flexible platform for kinetic builds, exotic builds, and energy builds. Granted, it's not going to excel in EPG like some other ships in this list will. It won't excel in energy damage like other ships will, but it's a science destroyer, so it's going to be able to do energy damage okay if you go into tactical mode. It also has a battle cloak because it's a 32nd century starship. And whenever you consider all that stuff with flexibility and put alongside it the fact that it's like killing like the kinetic charts for the DPS league right now, it has to be here. It also has really high hull, which makes tanking even easier to do on this thing. Most science vessels have low hull, high shields. This ship flies pretty much like a regular cruiser, except it's also really maneuverable too. Like if I had a 1.45 hull ratio cruiser, I would expect it to have maybe at most like a 0.18 impulse and maybe like a 6 to 8 turn. This thing is really maneuverable for everything else that it's giving you. It is so insane. If you're really curious about the various ways to tank on this thing, feel free to see that Courage comparisons video in terms of bridge officer seating. I will probably have a video maybe in terms of how I build the Courage class, because I actually did decide to get it because of how stupidly good this thing is for tanking. In terms of its weaknesses, in S and like A tier, I'll talk about weaknesses of ships. It doesn't have hangar bays. It doesn't have radar flanking. So if you're going to do a build specifically around hangar bays or around radar flanking, there are better ships to pick. Additionally, for your scatter volley builds, the ship only has 4 forward weapons, so that's going to be on the weaker side for that. Granted, we don't have any science vessels in the game with 5 forward weapons, so this is honestly as good as you're going to get for that, really. And additionally, science destroyers only have the standard science vessel master package. Scout ships have a more offensive version with crit severity in their master package, while this ship doesn't. That being said, that's really the only weaknesses of this ship. And so, yeah, it's an extremely strong ship, and that's why it has to be in S tier. And with that said, we'll go into our like handful of A tier, and these are some ships that you would expect to be here. We're going to start off with the 29th century vessels, also known as the Verne and the Verne clones. If you look at the stats here, they have the exact same stats. They are carbon copies of each other, with just the looks different between them. Even when we look at some of the other ships in this video, like there'll be something different between some of the variants, with like a smidgen of stats or something. These ships are legitimately the exact same. The Klingon and Romulan versions don't even get cloaks. The Romulan version doesn't even have a singularity core, so it's not even considered a science warbird, which sucks. So yeah, they're literally just carbon copies. So it's like whatever one is the cheapest on the exchange, or whatever one you want to pick for the particular looks to fly is what you would be picking. Still great ships nonetheless because of their extremely high flexibility, and the generally recommended go-to option if you're going to do just pure anomalies for your build. just because the meta is just go full exotics in every seat besides the ensign seat for emergency powered aux, because of some traits and stuff that synergize with that. Keep in mind, because of how scout ships work, if and when we get a full spec temporal scout ship, that will make these ships obsolete. And if one of those ships eventually got released, I would probably bump these ships down to B tier and put the temporal scout ship in A tier. So just as an FYI, that's where I would honestly judge them at this point. Until we get that, these ships are still very, very strong. And if you look at my Excel that I'll publish after I get all 3 videos out, these ships take up the 2nd through 4th slot because they are technically 3 different ships. Like if you go to loot boxes, they are 3 different ships, so they're taking the 2nd through 4th spots. So A tier is already gonna be pretty tight. Right after the Vern and the Vern clones is the legendary Glen. We have so many cross fields in the game that I just call this the Glen, even though it is another cross field variant. It's because it's a very top tier side tour platform. Now, if you want to be technical here for a DPS standpoint, if you want to do a pure kinetic build, Commander Command and Lieutenant Commander Temporal is actually the seating that you want, but that doesn't exist in the game at the moment. There is technically a cruiser that's actually very close to that, and we'll talk about it in the cruiser section in a different video. But until we get to that video, in terms of at least for Sci-Torp, this is a very, very solid platform. Pretty much the seating that you would want. Technically, you'd want Ensign Engineering instead of Lieutenant Engineering, but it's still a good ship nonetheless. It is technically a one-trick pony, but you can make it into a workable tank thanks to some of the new traits that are available if you have some people willing to send their pets to be around your starship. Because it's harder than the Vern to tank in my opinion, because of the lack of flexible seating here. I've rated slightly below the Vern, but they are still very, very strong ships. Below this one is the Sphere Builder science vessel, which technically isn't labeled as a multi-mission science vessel in its name, but it really is a super strong starship. Additionally, this is one of our temporal plus intelligence combos for science vessels, which is a very strong combination. Additionally, this is our one combo that actually is a full spec temporal with that temporal intelligence combo, which really ranks this thing higher. So even though you might not necessarily like the bridge officer seating as much, because the Lieutenant Commander Tactical does limit it a little bit, temporal intel is not something to snuff at. It is very nice to have both those things on the same ship. Spore Infusion Anomalies is nice to have for intel, and then full spec temporal means you get to get all the best parts of temporal while getting intelligence stuff for Spore Infusion Anomalies at the same time. Obviously, if you're going to tank, there are better options than S and B tier, but this is a very solid one as well. And because it's a multi-mission vessel, it's got a hangar bay over what the legendary Glen has. So this is a very, very strong ship, and I like it, and I like her a lot. And to round out A tier, we have the Vulcan Jellyfish. This is our only full spec scout ship, and it's got the best DPS mastery package with that extra 15% crit severity because it gets to be a scout ship. The reason why this ship is here, even though technically on DPS charts this thing is not going to be as high as some of the other ones, it's because emergency power to engines is not a meta bridge officer ability for exotic based builds. Because of that, maneuverability on science vessels matters a lot more than it does for cruisers and escorts. And so because of that, having a starship with very high maneuverability and having pilot maneuvers is going to make a big difference on some maps. Now, yes, on ISC it's not going to matter. It'll matter a little bit more in HSC, and it matters a lot on many more of the PvE maps for TFOs anyway. Again, it's not going to be something that's going to be like super high up on like your DPS theoreticals, but in practice, it's going to be a very good starship. What does hold it back a little bit is that besides pilot maneuvers, pilot mirror worker isn't really something that is super strong in PvE. That being said, if we went to PvP, it'd be a little bit better. But again, PvP is not going to be considered for this video, and so I think it's fine leaving this here. The other two scout ships are in B tier, so that's why I feel comfortable leaving this in A tier. If you want to, if in your own personal list you want to adjust this stuff and put this in B tier or C tier if you really hate this ship, you're more than welcome to. But the master package definitely helps. Like, its base chassis is really nice, and the high maneuverability, higher than regular scout ships, and the pilot maneuvers, in my opinion, bumps up a little bit higher than what regular scout ships would normally have. So that is why this ship is here, and I think it's a good ship for y'all to pick if you so choose. Now that we're getting into B tier, we're going to start with a couple of the really durable science vessels. Basically, the ones that I like to tank with if you're not going to be choosing the Courage class Science Destroyer. And to start off here, we're going to start with the Sea Story Eternal. Again, another full spec starship that, from a tanking standpoint, Lieutenant Commander Engineering is what we prefer for tanking, because we get reverse shield polarity and Ox to Sif in the build. And remember, having higher Ox power means Ox to Sif and other heals in our build are just going to be better. So it's a very, very strong spammable heal, and we get reverse shield polarity, which is really, really nice. The base stats are actually a little bit higher than regular science vessels as well, because it's a multi-mission science vessel, which is nice. But additionally, we get the Chrono Tachyon Capacitor, which, needless to say, is the best tanking console in the entire game. So what's going on with this particular console is you have an AoE taunt for 15 seconds, which during the taunt, you also get a hull and shield heal, which is nice. You have a guaranteed threat on you for 15 seconds, and then after that ends, you get a boost to energy damage, crit chance, and crit severity for another 15 seconds. So basically what's happening with this console is you get you force enemies to attack you, and you have more survival during that. And then after the force taunt ends, you get additional damage, so you get additional threat to keep enemies on you after the taunt ends as well. So this is a super, super great console. Yes, the passes are a little lackluster, but the clicky itself is super, super good. If Cryptic let all unique consoles be usable on all starships, this would be one of the consoles that I would put on every single tank that I would ever play inside of this game. It is that good. There is another console that's slightly stronger for all playstyles, but for tanking, this is the best one by far. Also keep in mind, the console that makes this ship really, really good for tanking is from the 31st Century Cruiser. So if you're going to go for the Eternal for a tanking playstyle, I recommend just buying the full 6th Gen 31st Century pack to get that console to be able to get the console and the starship for a little bit cheaper. And just at this point, because we're getting closer to Black Friday like next month, just wait for the sales around then and get it for a little bit cheaper than 6K Zen. With that said, the Legendary Voyager is actually very, very comparable to the Sea Story Eternal. So if you're someone who's just going to buy the 10th anniversary bundle instead, Legendary Voyager is very, very comparable. Really the biggest differences here, you're trading out Lieutenant Commander Universal and Ensign Science for Lieutenant Science and Lieutenant Universal. And for these builds, you're typically going to have that Universal seat for Science. And so you're trading out a Lieutenant Commander Science ability for another Lieutenant Science ability. So it is slightly weaker there. And you have a very, very slightly weaker clicky console that is unique. A Blade of Armor is the best bonus damage resistance console in the game by far. Nothing else comes close at all. It has the slight con of taking your weapons offline while taking your weapons and shields offline for the duration. However, if you just don't build around energy weapons and you wait to use this to whenever your shields are basically gone anyway, then you lose the two cons to using the console, and then it's super, super strong as a survival console itself. Keep in mind, unlike the Sea Story Eternal's Chrono Tachyon Capacitor, this thing doesn't have any way to increase your threat. That being said, exotic boats can make threats super, super easily. So That's not the end of the world for something like cruisers and escorts, which have a bigger issue trying to get threat. Exotic boats are able to get threats much easier for their comparative DPS. So it's not the end of the world, and that's why it is still here. But that is something to keep in mind. It also has a much higher hull ratio, which makes the blade armor work much better on this ship. And it's why the fleet version of the Intrepid class is going to be so much lower on this list. Because the fleet Intrepid has a much lower and basically standard hull ratio, while this ship has that 1.25 hull ratio, while still having reasonable enough shields to have shields be meaningful as well. Commander Mirror Worker does help with the ship. From a tanker's perspective, that pilot seat really doesn't matter. Mirror Worker means that you get an extra clicking console to do fun stuff with, or an extra survival console if you really need it. After them, we have the Voth Bastille, which is another temporal ship. It's a nice strong tank as well, and it's got a good clicking console. If you get another external ship called the Tier 5 Voth Dreadnought Cruiser, you're able to get the Ward Repair ship, which on the offset you think, well, a self-res doesn't seem powerful, right? I mean, like, why would I ever want to sacrifice a console slot to put this console in? Well, from a tank perspective, let's put it this way. In Hive Onslaught Elite, one of the recommended starship traits typically for that map is a trait called Invincible. And it's because there is some stuff in the map that can pretty much one-shot you. So having a starship trait to make sure that you don't die is something worthwhile for that particular map. However, you only have 6 starship traits, and you have 12 consoles on Tier 6X starships, or 13 if it's Commander Mirror Worker. But for most starships, it's just 12 consoles versus 6 starship traits. For that particular map, guess what? Instead of having Invincible, what you can have instead is this console, which whenever you get one shot, instead of just surviving through it, with this console you basically die, and you can just immediately push the console and you're back right into the fight. Also keep in mind, if you use the console before your ship actually fully blows up, like if you click console before the animation of you blowing up finishes, you get to keep all of the buffs that were on your ship before you technically died. So if you have quick fingers, this thing is honestly just as good as Invincible in practice for PvE, for tanking. And so this does definitely help for HSE. That being said, and you know, Commander Temporal is nice, and Lieutenant Command is also nice because you have rally point marker. The big downside to this ship, honestly, is the cost, and that's just what it comes down to. As much as it'd be nice to try to justify this ship, it's pretty much just a more expensive single character version of the Eternal Science Vessel. And you also don't have the hangar bay of the Eternal Science Vessel either. So as much as this ship is fun and cool to use, in practice, I would just go with the Eternal. Now granted, the Eternal's looks isn't for everyone, and you might like the Voth Bastille a little bit more. And so if that's the case, then honestly, they're both very, very comparable. But I still view this ship a little bit lower than the other two. But still a great platform regardless. Pretty much ideal bridge officer seating for that too. I mean, the Eternal technically had Lieutenant Tactical, which you might think, well, that's not ideal for pure exotic, but it was Lieutenant Tactical / Temporal, which made it so that you could just have essentially an Ensign Tactical with an extra temporal ability in there. So again, this ship in many ways is just a more expensive Eternal, but it's still a good ship nonetheless for tanking. After this one, we actually get a random B tier starship that doesn't have a full specialization. So why the heck am I putting this ship here? Well, non-cool ships have the strongest console in the game accessible to them, called the Temporal Distress Beacon. For those of you that have played the Temporal War missions, might have noticed that the non-cool ships are really annoying to blow up, because whenever you hurt them a little bit, they spawn this this time slip duplicate that you have to take out before you can actually damage the main ship. Well, if you fly a not cool ship, you can also equip a console that does the exact same thing. It's so annoying in PvP that this is the most frequently banned console in PvP. And so it's still great there if you really wanted to do that and you manage to get into a map that doesn't have it banned. But that, again, PvP is not really considered for this video. For PvE, what it comes down to is that this is a console that gives you 12% crit severity for its passive, and whenever you want, you can click the active to be practically immune to all damage, not just energy damage, but all damage for 30 seconds. Granted, there might be situations where it might not last the 30 seconds, but the way that the AI targeting works in this game is that the AI targets whatever is the most threatening thing. A time slip duplicate that's doing no damage to the enemy is not threatening to the enemy. However, the AI doesn't know that it needs to target the time slip duplicate in order to actually damage your ship. So, unless the time slip duplicate happens to get stuck in some like chain effects or stuck in like AoEs from enemies, there's not a lot of enemies that have AoEs, by the way. Unless the time slip basically gets stuck in the crossfire of enemies trying to target you, it's going to last for the full 30 seconds. And keep in mind for how long 30 seconds is, reverse shield polarity 3 with the duty officer extender to extend it by 8 seconds only lasts 28 seconds. And that only gives you practical immunity against energy damage. This is a 30-second clicky that gives you immunity to all damage for 30 seconds. And so if you combine this with like reverse shield polarity 2 or reverse shield polarity 3, you're looking at a very substantial amount of time where you basically can't be hurt by energy damage, and a little bit less time, but still a significant amount of time where all types of damage just won't hurt you. So unlike, for instance, the Voth Bastille, that's like, oh yeah, here's the thing that's about to kill me. I'll just use the clicky to get back. Oh, something's about to kill me. I'm going to click this button to say, sorry, enemy, you're not going to kill me. And it's impossible to. The things that hurts this ship is that there's no primary specialization. That's why this ship is not ranked higher. If this ship had any primary specialization besides intel, it would have been A tier for sure, 100%. Unfortunately, none of the not cool ships are able to have a full spec bridge officer seat, which is unfortunate. And this is also another one of those consoles that is so stupidly strong that if Cryptic unlocked all of the unique consoles for all starships, the not cool science vessel would become a must buy for tank builds, because this strong console also happens to come from the not cool science vessel, which, I mean, for rankings for the other not cool ships in the other videos, that's not going to matter, because we're not talking about ships that for coming with stuff. We're talking about just the strength of them in theory anyway. This ship is still extremely strong, and its 2 specialist seats are on the seats that are the non-science, which means it's also easy to do a relatively pure exotic build on this starship too, because you just replace all the tactical abilities with intel, and then you replace your one non-engineering ability that you want with a pilot ability, because there are a few pilot abilities that actually do scale with aux power and exotic damage. So you just pick one of those ones and you can basically make it work. And so this is basically pretty much just a really great science vessel that can basically go pure exotic, and it has a clicky console that increases its damage just passively, and it's got a clicky that basically lets you go full glass cannon on the starship for most builds. And if you want to tank on her, you basically have a reverse shield polarity built into your console, so you don't have to worry about that in your build if you don't want to, or you can add it into your build if you wish, and then you're really strong for even longer in like ISC or HSC. It's a really fantastic starship. It's very underrated. Now, granted, I will mention this one last thing, even though it's not technically for the tier list. Nautical ships have the like sound that's always going on. So if you're someone who has like all game sounds on, that's probably going to annoy you after a while. So just keep that in mind. The noises can get annoying after a while. After him, we have our command science vessels. We have the Janeway and the Sona. Between those two, I view the Janeway a little bit better because, I mean, it's just a more modern version of it, frankly. It has a 4-2 layout. Higher hull, lower shields is better than lower hull, higher shields, frankly. It also has a battle cloak, and it has double lieutenant commander seating. So, great ship. The big issue with this ship is that it's just a weaker courage class. It's not as flexible as the courage class. It doesn't have tactical mode, and it's still a promo ship. The one advantage it has over the courage class is its speed. It is a little bit faster. But I mean, you're down a weapon. You don't have tactical mode, so you aren't going to have some of the flexibilities you would have had with the courage class as well. And you have more force the seating on this thing too. Is the ship still fine? Yeah. If you had a promo pack, would I tell you to pick the Janeway over the courage class? Probably not, unless you don't like flying a toilet in space. Then, you know, from a look standpoint, go ahead and pick the Janeway. You know, if you don't have like the Legendary Glen or something like that. Still a great ship. It's just, you know, there was already something way better than that in this tier list already. Of course, we have the Sona right after her. This is a starship that I would prefer for tanking because of its bridge RC in particular, but it's still very comparable otherwise. No battle cloak, and it's a 3-3 layout, and a little bit slower because it's just an older ship. As starships get newer and newer inside this game, they release more and more ships. They have to bump up the base stats to make new ships seem more appealing than the old stuff. But very, very comparable otherwise. It's got triple lieutenant instead of double lieutenant commander, lieutenant ensign. So that does hurt it a little bit, but not too much. It's still command intel, so it's still fine if you want to do a Sitor build. And again, it's not bad for tanking either. So I have some nostalgia for this, so that's why it's here instead of a little bit lower. But I don't even think, even with my biases in place, that it would go that much lower than this. Comparing this to this, not too much of a difference here. So, yeah, with that said, let's go ahead and move on. And now we're getting to some of the better fleet starships. Now, I'm rating these because I think Commander Temporal is really, really strong. So I've got the two Temporal ships here before our scout ships. I know some people really value that flexibility that scout ships provide over this. So I can definitely see things going either way for you. When it comes down to it, the Fleet Nautilus is one I'm going to put here first. It's basically the Lobai Edolg Sphere Builder Science Vessel, but it's just a weaker fleet alternative to it. You lose that Lieutenant and Engineering Intelligence seat for Engineering Temporal instead. It's still fine, and you have an extra Ensign Forced Bridge Officer seat, and you don't have the hangar, but otherwise they're fairly comparable otherwise. Still very, very offensive oriented. So if you're wanting the Sphere Builder Science Vessel but can't afford it, this is a decent alternative that does similar things. Keep in mind though, this is like more of like the DPS focused one. If you want a more tank version, like if you want a tank version of the Eternal, that's where the Fleet of Birth comes into play. I was surprised Cryptic let this ship be a tank. I was surprised. I was like, wait, why are you letting this ship have Lieutenant Commander Engineering? Like, it's known for blowing up. Like, when I think of ships that like are on screen to get blown up, I think of this ship. So letting this ship basically have the bridge officer layout of the Sea Story Eternal, it's like, huh, that's interesting, Cryptic. Are you sure you really want to do that? Oh yeah, oh okay. Yeah, I mean, there are people on Reddit that are saying like, yeah, like I figured out a way to tank on the Old Earth. I'm like, of course, it's basically the Eternal, but it's just slightly lower stats. and there's no secondary temporal seat on that tactical seat there. In all practicality, you would have made that Lieutenant Bird Science and the Ensign Universal in Science anyway, which means it basically would be the same as the Eternal for most builds anyway. So this is still a good ship. If you're wanting to tank with a fleet starship, this is one of the good ones that I would consider. It's either this or the Fleet Titan, which we'll get to later. It's still a great alternative to the Eternal. Of course, the Eternal has higher stats, a hangar bay, and a really strong tanking console. But because of how these tier listings are working, this ends up in B tier. If we're doing like the my old composite tier list, funny enough, the Eternal would have actually shown up in A tier, but because of the way that the wonky stuff moved around, because I'm just having science vessels alone in this video, they both end up being B tier here. So just for reference for the whole list, if we compare versus all 300, the Eternal actually ends up being in A tier. So just for context. After them, we have the Fleet Nukari Junior Scout Ship. This is the weaker fleet alternative of the Verne clones, and it's got the Scout Ship Mastery Package to give itself an extra 15% crit severity. In practicality, the way that these ships work is you build them basically the exact same as a Verne, and it's just that you don't have Mucker reconstruction on the ship itself. And so you have that Scout Ship Mastery Package and Raider flanking to help you. And because of that, I know that a lot of TPS captains will say that this is like one of the best ships in the game after the Verne. And I can see that, but I personally feel that molecular reconstruction matters for exotic builds in particular. And so I feel that those ships do need to be higher ranked than this one. This is still really good. This is still B tier for a starship without access to a primary specialization. So if you're wanting flexible seating, if you're wanting something like the Verne that's slightly more affordable, this is an option. Keep in mind you need tier 5 fleet colony to get this ship, which is still costly. And unlike, like being invited to a fleet map to get like consoles and stuff, to get fleet starships, you have to be in that fleet to get access to that fleet's rank of like fleet military or fleet colony. So you have to find a fleet that has a tier 5 fleet colony in order to get this ship. Not the easiest thing to do, but if you ask around enough and beg, you'll be able to find people. A slightly weaker alternative, in my opinion, is the Event Vulcan to Palace Scout ship. It basically just sacrifices Lieutenant Commander Temporal for Lieutenant Commander Intelligence, which I personally feel is slightly weaker. But it's not the end of the world. If you happen to have the Vulcan to POW and you're like, should I bother like trying to ask people to get the Junior Scout ship? You can build them basically the same. If you just look at the sample builds out there for like the Verne stuff, just replace the temporal stuff with intelligence stuff, and you'll get similar damage. It will be lower, but you'll still get similar damage. And if you see the rough maneuverability, it is a smidge better for the T'Pau. 18 to 19 on a fast starship isn't the super end of the world. It's really impulse that matters more, and that's why the Vulcan Jellyfish was higher ranked than these two ships here. With that said, after those ones, we're going to have the Crossfield's Spearhead refit here, and I know people are not gonna agree with me for this, but here's the reality. You can do plain exotic damage with this ship just fine. If you're going to do Psi on this ship, this is one of the best platforms for it. Like, unless you're going for the Courage class, I'd say this is like your next best option, frankly, and one that doesn't look super terrible. You can keep in mind, additionally, it's got Lieutenant Command, which means you can get rally point marker on this thing, so it's actually not bad for tanking either. So it's pretty strong for that. It's also got a Battle Cloak, which also helps the rankings a smidget. Yes, when it comes to pure exotic, it's not going to be as strong as the other ones in this list already, but it's still okay for that, and you get energy-based damage with sciencey stuff too. So because of that, I feel that I'm comfortable putting it here. and comfortable putting it slightly in front of the Crown Anorak Science Dreadnought. Because, well, this ship just has intel seating alongside science. So, yes, I mean, this is a Science Dreadnought. It's got good stats. It's not maneuverable, which is to be expected for Science Dreadnoughts. Thankfully, its specialist seating is on the non-science stuff. So you can make this basically a full exotic build if you wish, or you can do side stuff with her as well. The Cronton Lance sucks, but it technically has a lance, and it also has a hangar bay. From a tanking perspective, I honestly prefer the refit with its Merrick Worker stuff over the Anoraks personally. I know people are probably gonna disagree with me on that, but the Anoraks is a really old ship. Yes, if you go back several years ago, back before we had lots of the better clicky consoles, yes, the Anoraks had access to some of the best clicky consoles for survival in the game. They have all been outscaled and are basically obsolete now. So what we're only looking at now for the Anoraks is just what the ship itself, by itself, is giving you. And I don't feel it's giving you enough to beat the crossfield refit nowadays. But I know that's an unpopular opinion. That is just my opinion on the matter. So take that as you will. I still think it's a good ship. It's still B tier, barely B tier, but I think it's still good enough to be B tier. All right. With that said, we will head into C tier stuff. What you're going to notice for C tier, by the way, is pretty much all the rest of our 7-weapon science vessels are going to be showing up here, as well as some other starships that don't have primary specializations that I think are still good, are going to be ones that are going to end up here in C tier. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. My first one here is going to be the Section 31 Intel Science Destroyer. Again, I've mentioned before that I do not like full spec intel. That being said, for Science Destroyers, it is preferable to have your specialist seats on the 2 seats that can switch with your tactical mode. And you know what? Compared to the other Science Destroyers and Science Spearheads and stuff, this ship actually does that. And this is one of 2 Science Destroyers that actually does that right. So I am going to give it credit and put it up at the top of C tier because of that. Also because of that, you can replace the tactical stuff with intel if you wish and do a pure exotic thing. It's not going to be as good as the Crown Anoraks, so I have to put it below it, which is why it's bumped down into C tier. You can go into tactical mode and do an energy-based build on her as well, but because you have instant science alongside that commander science seat, you're going to have a couple of filler science things you have to deal with inside the build. So that hurts it a little bit more. If it was Ensign Engineering, or Ensign Universal, it would have been at least a smidge better, in my opinion, but not by much. Again, Intel's one of those weakest specializations. So I feel that it's decent enough to just put it here above some of the other ships in this list. And after that, we get to a couple of the torpedo boats. And I'm going to start with the Herc ship here. Now, the difference between the Herc Science Vessel and the Fleet Titan are very minor. You could easily put one in front of the other, and I'll be like, yeah, I can see the justifications for either, frankly. For the Herc Science Vessel, what's happening with this one is that it's a low-buy alternative to the Legendary Glen, and you're basically losing Commander Temporal to get a hangar bay. That's what's happening basically for the differences between them. I do think that is a downgrade. But hey, you know what? If you really don't like Federation looks and want something really odd and different, this is still a fine option. It's still decently maneuverable, still has decent stats as well. A smidge better for tanking because of its particular seating. But if you're going side torp, you're going to be making that Lieutenant Universal 8 science seat anyway, which means the Glen would just be a better ship. It's just the way it is. You could do other stuff with it though too. Which means for like pure torp stuff, I feel will be a bit better than the Legendary Glen in some aspects, but still, micro reconstruction is still really, really strong, and temper blaze and recursive shearing 3 is still really nice to have still too. So I still have to say the Legendary Glen is just just leaps and bounds above this thing, which is why it is here. And as for the Fleet Titan, it is here basically because it's got 0 bridge option flexibility. Unlike the Herc ship, which has seats that you can move, or you can make different types, with the Fleet Titan, you have no flexibility. That being said, for a side tour, it's not bad. Maybe I would have wanted Ensign Tactical to be something else, but otherwise, it's still a fine starship. Tactical mode is a complete bait. Do not go into tactical mode with this ship. I don't really see much of a point besides being an energy-based tank. Even then, there are better options, frankly. That being said, it still has decent stats to tank. It's below the 1.25 hull ratio that I recommend for tanking, so you are going to struggle a little bit with that. I normally have a 1.25 hull ratio as my personal rating for that, just because if you have that 1.25 hull ratio and build properly, most stuff in the game can't one-shot you. Whenever you're below that ratio, a lot more stuff can one-shot you, which is a little unfortunate. That being said, it's still a good side tour platform. It's basically a fleet alternative to the Legendary Glen that basically replaces Chimera Temporal with higher stats and an extra rear weapon. So maybe with an extra mine on the build for a kinetic boat, it might be a little more serviceable than the Herc ship, and maybe some situations. I am not a kinetic torpedo like DPS player. Augie can probably guide you more as to whether this ship or the Herc ship is better for a pure kinetic build. My gut feeling is the Herc ship is better, but that's just my thoughts there on the matter. But who knows? This ship might actually be a better ship. Nonetheless, I think this ship and the Herc are very, very comparable, and so I feel that they should be side by side here in the tier list. And after them, we have the OG Crossfield Spearhead. This is here because, well, this is another Intel Temporal starship, which again, that's a very nice combination to have. Additionally, when we look at the base stats of this ship, it is pretty much a very strong, ideal combination of hull and shields for if you're wanting to tank. The things that hurt this ship is that it's got no primary specialization. That's honestly what hurts the ship. It's still very maneuverable and very durable for its maneuverability, and so I feel that it still should be a high tier starship. But I mean, if you're looking for lots of the refit has more options for the various playstyles. Although there are playstyles that this ship will outclass that one, like in pure exotic damage. I think the OG Spearhead is probably still going to be better than the Miracle Worker Spearhead refit, just the way it is, because Intel and Temporal is a really nice combination to have. But yes, the no primary spec, it does hurt the ship. That being said, I would rate the OG Spearhead above the Mirror Crossfield. Just like when it comes down to it, yes, you have a more maneuverable platform, but you're sacrificing the awesome durability that the OG Crossfield had, which is sad. Yes, you have Lieutenant Commander Temporal, which is an upgrade, but then you have Lieutenant Pilot, which for PvE is a downgrade over Intel. So you have slightly worse stats for tanking. You have, in my opinion, slightly worse bridge offer seating as well. Yeah, you get tactical mode, but I don't think tactical mode is good enough to justify the other aspects, and so I feel that it's a little bit worse. I know, again, people are going to disagree with me, and they'll say that the Mirror Crossfield is better than the OG Crossfield, but I feel that there's enough people to say otherwise that I'm comfortable putting Mirror Crossfield, which is a promo ship and released later, above what the original Crossfield was. Feel free to debate me in the comments as to why I'm wrong here, but I think I think these ships are where they need to be in this tier list. After them, we have the Baul sentry vessel, which is a spearhead. I don't know why they didn't just call it a science spearhead, but whatever. It's still basically the science version of tactical warships, but it is what it is. This is a classic example of Cryptic realized they made a not so great starship, so what they decided to do was bump up its base stats to make it appealing for players to have. And they also bumped up the clicky console to ridiculous levels so people would buy the Starship. If you want to tank on this thing, you can. My comparison video on the battleship does go into what I recommend, but it is difficult to do. It is just the way it is. And its seating isn't necessarily the greatest either, frankly. So if you're curious about that, feel free to see that video. I'm not the biggest fan of this thing, but I can't deny that having those base stats is definitely helpful. It's basically the base stats of a Science Dreadnought on the Science Spearhead frame. So it is what it is. After them, we have our 3 Science Dreadnoughts that are remaining. We have the Cardassian one here, alongside the Paradox and the Sona Collector. And between those 3, I would say the Cardassian Damar overall is probably the best of the 3, because it's the best for a pure exotic stuff for what's going on. Yes, all 3 of these freaking Science Dreadnoughts have intelligence as their highest specialization. I really hope the next Science Dreadnought that Cryptic releases is not intelligence primary. Please, Cryptic, if you're watching, have the next Science Dreadnought be something different. Please, 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 please. Anyway, the problems with this Dreadnought is this Science Dreadnought is basically a Science Spearhead in durability, but it still has as Science Dreadnought maneuverability, which sucks. That being said, it's still an okay ship regardless. Lower than most of the other like Spearheads and such, but not bad enough that that it would go to like D tier or anything like that. Alongside them, we have the Paradox, which is another Intel ship. The problem with this ship, like the Cardassian Damar can do DPS just fine. The problem with the Paradox and the Sona is that those are both meant to be tanking ships. Frankly, that's pretty much the way that they are built and designed. There are way better options in the game, frankly, to do that. Thanks to some new traits, you can do some shenanigans on the ship with the Lieutenant Command seat if you make both those abilities command. I've theorized it before whenever I talked about the Malachowski on the channel, or I guess the Malachowski / Clark comparisons video, where I talked about the trait from that ship and how that would work with this ship in particular for tanking. But for the vast majority of things, it's just not that great in my opinion. Do I think it's still serviceable? Sure. And if you're wanting a more budget version of the Random Interax and feel you must have a Science Dreadnought, sure, this is the one that I would recommend to go ahead and to pick up. Again, doesn't have a primary specialization, but again, besides the Cardassian Science Dreadnought, which is Commander Intelligence, which isn't that great of a primary specialization, and the rest of the Science Dreadnoughts don't have a primary specialization either. For Science Dreadnoughts, no primary spec is basically run-of-the-mill regular things of what we expect, frankly. At least at this moment in time. And of course, we have the Sona Collector after them, which trades out Lieutenant Command for Ensign Temporal. Now, yes, technically this ship has intelligence and temporal seating, which is a nice combination. But when one of those seats is Ensign, I don't really consider it a combination. Add insult to injury that it only has 2 tactile consoles, and so Do Psi doesn't really work well on the ship. Means that you're supposed to be a pure exotic boat on the Starship, which sure, it's got decent hull and shields and maneuverability, but at the same time, for a promo ship, if that's what you're doing, why not pick the Courage class? I mean, or just something else that I've listed higher. There's so many better options to pick, and sure, the Sona ships have some unique consoles. At this point in Star Trek Online, I feel that they've basically gotten outscaled. For other universally applicable and universally slottable consoles, frankly. Because of that, I just don't really see the point for the ship. That being said, it's still a 7-weapon ship, and it has some flexible seating, so it still gets C tier. I have a strong bias against this ship, and I will admit that I do, so there's probably ways to make this ship better than other ones in this list. My bias against it just means I can't rate it higher than here. All right, so with that being said, let's go on to our next part, which is going to be our mega bundle starships. Now, fortunately, we don't have very many of these for science vessels. When we get to escorts and cruisers, we're going to have so many more that we have to deal with. But thankfully, for science vessels, we only have one mega bundle that we have to deal with, and that's our multi-mission science vessel mega bundle. And so the way that these mega bundles have worked in the past is that there is a tactical version, an engineering version, and a science version. And when you look at them, between the 3 different factions, they have slightly smidgely different stats, but in all practicality, the 3 variants for each faction works honestly the exact same way. Thankfully nowadays, because of cross-faction things, they don't have to make these stupid mega bundles anymore, which is great. Unfortunately, that means we have less warbirds coming out nowadays, and that also sucks. It'd be cool if we actually got really good science warbirds, and we don't have any primary specialization science warbirds in the game either. So when it comes to at least science for science warbirds, these are the best options that you have. When it comes to the 3 variants, I have ranked the tactical version the highest, just because these ships get a unique weapon called auxiliary-based cannons. And what these cannons do is that they're like your phaser, disruptor, and plasma quad cannons, in that like phaser quad cannons, for instance, are weapons that drain engine power instead of weapon power. Aux cannons do the same thing, but for auxiliary power. They're ones that drain auxiliary power instead of weapon power. Which means, even though my normal rules at the beginning of this video said if you don't have 7 weapons, you shouldn't be doing energy-based damage with science vessels, this is like our lone exception in this video. Because you're able to drain aux power, and you're going to be aux power primary anyway for science vessels, generally speaking, these ships are not bad to do directed energy weapon damage with. That being said, Cryptic, if you're listening to me, I think it would be really cool if in the R&D system, if we could craft all types of auxiliary weaponry, not just cannons, just because on Xbox and PlayStation, players there can't really adjust their power levels very well, and so if they want to do an energy exotic based playstyle, it's really impractical for them to do so. It really sucks for them to try to make that work. On PC, it's a lot easier, but on console, it's hard. Auxiliary-based weaponry wouldn't necessarily be meta, but it would let players there be able to do the energy stuff that I've mentioned earlier in this video. Your answer is already in the game, and so honestly, just making a simple unlock saying, if you own one of these multi-mission starships in this multi-mission mega bundle, then you can craft all 6 types of weapons in the crafting system and sell them on the exchange. I think that would work out well, but that's just me throwing out stuff that I think would help the player base. You can feel free to think about that yourselves, Cryptic, as to how you might want to proceed doing that. I think it would help the player base significantly on console, and would make a lot of the science vessels there, especially the 7 weapon ones, sell much more. But that's just me ranting there. In terms of 3 variants here, tactical allows you to use aux cannons well. If you don't care about using aux cannons, I would say the science version is probably the best, because you'd be able to get an extra science ability to throw stuff out there for exotic based damage. If you want a tank, then obviously the engineering one is one that you want, so you can have Lieutenant Commander engineering in your seating. Beyond that, they're all extremely similar, so you can just take your pick of what you prefer. The Federation version is the one with Space Barbie. The Clan version is the one that's the most durable, and the Rollin version is the one that gets a battle cloak. So based upon what you would prefer to have for your ships, is basically going to be which one that you prefer nowadays. Because across faction flying, you don't need to buy the full mega bundle anymore. I will make the added note. I did mention Space Border for Federation because there are the tier 5 Vesta ships as well. I don't know. Technically, the Vesta would be a good a good like candidate for a legendary starship, but because of the contracts the Cryptic had to sign to make the tier 5 and tier 6 Vestas in the first place, that one is probably a lot harder to do than some of the other ships inside of this game right now. That being said, you know, the multiple science vessels can have aux cannons, so that's something cool. And when it comes to Romulan science warbirds, these are the best science warbirds in the game right now. And it's sad because these ships do not have a primary specialization. And no, as an FYI, I do not count the Sui Moore science vessel as a science warbird because the Sui Moore does not have access to a singularity core. And it does not have access to a Romulan battle cloak either. So when we think of a science warbird, we generally think of singularity core and a Romulan battle cloak. The Sui Moore does not have either, so I do not consider that a science warbird. So with that definition in place, yes, the science warbirds from this mega bundle are the best science warbirds in the game. Cool. All right. With that said, right behind them are our fleet research vessels. We have the Sutherland and their Romulan and Klingon knockoffs. The Noxov actually looks pretty decent for science vessels. Basically, the big difference that we've got here is that you only have 2 base tactical consoles with these ships, which basically means you really need to do pure exotic builds for this thing. Lieutenant Tactical means that you aren't going to be able to completely have complete freedom for pure exotics everything. But Lieutenant Commander Engineering Temporal means you can basically ignore the engineering seed and have full temporal abilities there if you wish. Additionally, they have reasonably high hull for science vessels. A little bit behind the Fleet Titan, but not by much. And these ships have way more flexibility to do exotic stuff than what the Fleet Titan can actually do. That said, the Fleet Titan has command seating, so you can do side torp a little bit easier with them in some aspects than what these ships can anyway. For their differences, again, the Klingon version is the one you pick for durability. The Romulan one you pick for the battle cloak, and because these ships do not normally have access to dual cannons, and Romulan warbirds always have access to dual cannons, the Romulan version also gets dual cannon access, but you only have 2 tactical consoles on these ships, so that's not really encouraged. But you technically can if you wanted to. Then the Sutherland, of course, has the most visual stuff on it, so it is the space barrier option once again. And again, when it comes down to these ships, if you're wanting to do a pure exotic build but don't want to be glass cannon like a scout ship, these are decent alternatives. They're basically weaker one-trick pony variants of the multi-mission mega bundle starship that also do not have a hangar bay either. So in many ways, I personally consider them like a little bit weaker, but pretty much I consider them basically just the fleet weaker variants of the multi-mission mega bundle starships. So yeah, if you're really wanting a cheaper version of the multi-mission mega bundle starships, these guys are not bad options to go ahead and pick. And with that said, we're going to wander into D tier territory. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, when it comes to science carriers, I have said that I didn't want any science carrier to be above D tier. What that means is that for D tier and E tier, basically, like what I consider the good science carriers will be at the top of D tier, and then the bad science carriers are going to be in E tier. And because of the few amount of starships in D and E tier, that's going to take up most of our available slots for D and E tier. So that said, we'll go ahead and start with our good science carriers. And so our first one is going to be the Tholian Drogumo. I hate nanny builds. I do not agree with the playstyle. I do agree with it in theory, in that, you know, in other MMOs, you know, it's nice to have damage, tanking, and then your healer/support bot. But in Star Trek Online, generally speaking, tanks fill both that support and tank role at the same time. That's generally how, in this game, how things work. And because of that, the mechanics of most TFOs are such that they're much easier than other MMOs, to the point that a lot of your serious MMO players are like, Star Trek Online is not a real MMO because it doesn't have that challenge and requiring coordination to get through the raids. That being said, MMOs have gotten much more casual over the years, generally speaking, so I can totally get as to why Star Trek Online is not going to wander back into trying to make more of those hardcore raids like they had in the early days of Star Trek Online. That being said, if you really want a Nandy-based build of just trying to debuff lots of enemies without doing tons of damage, so that your DPS player that you're trying to inflate in their damage can just mop them up super quickly, technically this is the starship to pick. Honestly, if you wanted these pets, you could very easily just pick the Tholian Dreadnought Cruiser, get the exact same pets, and you have one hangar, but you have 8 weapons now, so now you can easily tank on the other starship and have those unique pets that can basically just do a very similar role to what this ship is doing. But you also can tank really well too. So because of that, the Tholian Dreadnought has to be D tier, obviously, but if you are wanting that playstyle that I do not agree with, this is the starship for you. Otherwise, there are much better options to choose inside of this game. Right after the Aduro Grumo is the Brain Carrier. And this ship is here, even though I don't like the bridge off you're seeing, is here completely because of the frigates. And you'll see this with the next couple of carriers as well. The really good, strong ones are the ones that have good pets. And the Brain frigates are by far the best damaging frigates in the entire game. Their AI is good, and the margin between number 1 and number 2 for DPS frigates is a pretty big margin. Now, it is hard to access because the Brain Carrier is an event starship, and to get the Brain frigates on these things, you have to also have a tier 5 or tier 6 Brain Raider on that character too. And the Brain Raider is another event starship. So, unless you already have access to both Brain ships, account unlocked for you, I don't recommend going and wasting 2 Phoenix tokens just to get this playstyle. There are just better ships available for you to use instead for comparable pricing. Alongside that one is the Fecalari Carrier, which is here because even though the Lost Souls pets don't have the damage potential of those frigates, the Lost Soul pets still could do damage. They are exclusive to Fecalari starships, and this is a 7 weapon carrier, so you don't have the same issues of other science carriers of only being 6 weapons and can't use a secondary deflector. These ones get 7 and can't use a secondary deflector. So this feels much like what Dreadnought carriers typically are going to have in the tactical side of things. Because of that, I was half tempted to put this ship into as a Dreadnought carrier instead of a science carrier, but when you look at the rest of the scene, I think it's fine, especially whenever you consider that there's a ship coming up in just a couple of slides that also is Lieutenant Red Tactical plus Lieutenant Commander Command. I felt that it made sense to leave the Fecalari Carrier here in this list. So if you want to do a torpedo or side torpedo this thing, you definitely can. Obviously, this is still a science carrier. You're still lacking that secondary deflector, so it is still going to hurt. But in terms of list of science carriers, it is on the upper end of them. And then right after that one, we have our 2 Romulan warbirds. Or at least Romulan carrier warbirds anyway. These guys are here because not only can you use the regular support carrier things that are available if you have any support carrier on your characters, but they get to use Romulan drone ships. Romulan drone ships are a really good DPS frigate available if you own a Scimitar variant. Any of the Scimitars will unlock Romulan drone ships to be accessible from your fleet, or I guess if you want cheaper versions from the Lithium store. They are the number 2 DPS frigates inside the game. And so if you're wanting no thought DPS frigates and don't want to deal with Phoenix tokens, the way to go is to get a scimitar, and then you can fly the fleet support carrier warbird, and then you can have 2 whole hangar bays of those really strong DPS frigates. So in many ways, this support carrier warbird here is basically just the budget, or at least much more easily accessible option for a Marine carrier build. The one that has like lots of really good DPS frigates that you don't have to really have to buff them, and you can just do other stuff with your bridge officer alongside having good DPS frigates. As for why I'm rating the Talaru higher, it's because we have intel and temporal seeding. We don't have a secondary deflector, sadly, but still, intel temporal seeding is still a nice combination to have, and it's not instant temporal. We at least have lieutenant temporal seeding on this thing, and it's commander science with 2 universal seats alongside that, and your engineering seat you can replace with temporal things too. So this is a good bridge officer seating combination. If this was a regular science vessel, it would be a solid C. Honestly, it'd be a very solid C because of intel primary, but it would still be a decent thing because it's a carrier. It has to be D, but that being said, it's still fine. And again, this one's for more torpedo stuff, and it's because of the drone ships themselves as to why this thing is in D tier instead of E tier. Cool. All right, and so moving on, we have some more of our weakest of the fleet science vessels here. And here we have the 3 intel primary ships. Honestly, you can make easy arguments as to which ones are better than others. I personally like the Scryer. Now that I've looked more and more about having to look through these lists over and over again, I've warmed up to the Scryer a little bit more. They both have contemporary engineering, which means they're going to be a little bit better for tanking than anything else, but you still can do other stuff on them if you wish. Intel primary is like the worst specialization to have it as a primary, frankly. Intel seeding is still fine to have on a science vessel, but it would have been more preferable to have something else. That being said, fleet starships have just one specialization on them. So is Intel the worst thing to have? No, but it would have been better to have something else. I rank this one higher because the tactical seat can be replaced with intelligence, while with these starships, their 2 non-science seats do not have their specialization on them, which means they are more limiting in terms of what you're forced to put on those particular starships. That being said, we at least have a Klingon variant here that has a battle cloak, which is nice. With certain vanity shields, you can recreate the magic school bus on the starship. I remember when it was coming up, people were just saying that it looked terrible, and then someone figured out, hey, with the yellow vanity shield, you can make the magic school bus on this. But yeah, those 3 ships are all very comparable. Whether you like the Klingon one, the Discovery Hernandez, or if you rather would have the Starfleet Intelligence Scryer. They're all very, very comparable, and they at least have cloaks for having commander intel, which is nice. Not all intelligence ships have cloaks, which I think is silly, but at least they have what they're supposed to have on their ships, and so I will at least give these science vessels that. After them, we have the Fleet Intrepid long-range science vessel, which is here because of its because of the ablative armor console, which is also usable on this ship. Keep in mind, it's a lieutenant intelligence starship for a tier 5 fleet military starship. Of course, we aren't technically considering the cost of a starship and what it takes to get it for this video, but if we were, this would be super low on the list because it's a lieutenant intel seat for a tier 5 military starship. Not great. But at least it's engineering intel, so you can replace a undesirable engineering seat with intel if you wanted. And you can have lots of exotic abilities on the ship still as well. Again, it's the unique console that's pushing us up above some of the other science vessels, but there aren't that many left, frankly. And because it has a lower hull ratio, the ablative generator clicky isn't frankly as potent as it would be on the legendary Voyager. So this ship is where it's at. Technically, from an anomaly standpoint, it can have slightly more anomalies than legendary Voyager, but it's a pretty heavy cost to lose a primary specialization. And considering the Mirror Worker at least gives you an extra clicky console to do more fun stuff with, I just feel that it needs to be here. Cool. Okie dokie. Moving on, we have the Tholian Iktomi. And when I saw this ship, I was like, not particularly great with other ships that have come out later. What this ship basically is that it's the Voth Bastille that has a worse bridge accuracy and that also costs low buy. That being said, everyone recommends the Tholian Iktomi to get for exotic builds because the trait is so meta. Improved Photonic Officer is so great for exotic builds, and it's completely best in slot for any exotic tank build because every single element of that trait works for exotic tanks. The other stuff works really, really well for any exotic build, period, though. So the Tholian Iktomi is bought because of that. From a performance standpoint, it's a little lackluster. If you're going from a tanking perspective, though, I can see where you'd be coming from with this. But Lieutenant Commander Mirror Worker does not match up to Commander Temporal of the Voth Bastille, not anywhere in the slightest. So I basically just consider it a worse Voth Bastille from a performance standpoint. That being said, you can still replace one of the engineering abilities with the gravitic induction platform from the Mirror Worker abilities. So you only have 2 engineering abilities to worry about. So you can do some decent anomaly stuff with this thing too. And that's why it is right here alongside the Fleet Voyager. After them, we get to a couple of our event science vessels, which again, if we were doing the composite list of all like 300 starships, these vessels would be in C tier, just as an FYI to you all. These ships are still fine, but because we have to, because for this video, I'm just saying science vessels compared against themselves. Comparatively to other science vessels, they are D tier. If we compare this to a lot of cruisers, these would actually end up being C tier when it comes to the damage potential and stuff that it offers you. For the Krenum ship, it's a slightly more durable science vessel that has Lieutenant Commander Intel. If you compare this to like the Fleet Lucari ship, which is a little bit less durable, a little bit more maneuverable, but it has Lieutenant Commander Engineering Intel, which generally speaking, when it comes to builds, we would probably prefer the Lieutenant Commander Tactical Intel over Lieutenant Commander Engineering Intel, frankly. Just from a preferences standpoint, I would prefer this one even for tanking over the Lucari ship. Just gonna throw that out there. But they're still very comparable, and the Lucari bridge is super awesome still too. So they're both fine. Now, when it comes to unique consoles, they're usable on other ships. They both have fantastic consoles. The Lucari one has a great survival console for any tanking build, and then the Krenum one has an insane console for the flagship set. If you're going to tank on like the Odyssey or the Scimitar, it has a super strong console for that. So when it comes to consoles, they're both good because of the consoles, not really because of the starship themselves. So because this is just a starship ranking thing, these things have to show up here. And then after them, we have the Ricine Weather Control Vessel. Is this ship bad? Not really, but when in comparison to other science vessels, it just doesn't have much sticking out to it. And because Pilot is, when it comes to exotic builds at least, like pretty much just about the worst one, besides Miracle Worker, this is pretty much a Lieutenant Commander Universal seat on here, and so it's like as if it just had an extra Lieutenant Commander science seat on this thing. Granted, it's still a reasonably fast science vessel. That's not a scout ship. But it doesn't really bring much else to the table, in my opinion, to really justify it being higher. It still has cool looks on her. But from a performance standpoint, there's not much of a reason to pick this over something else, unless, of course, this is your only tier 6 science vessel. Then, of course, sure, go ahead and use her. It's just that there's many other science vessels that will just perform better. And now, with that said, we're getting into E territory. These are pretty much the worst of the worst. You can pretty much guess what ships are going to end up here. These are going to be our carriers that don't have any unique pets that are actually good, and one science vessel that I consider worse than the Rycian one. And then we'll get to our one F tier one that I consider like the worst of the worst. These are pretty much just science carriers here. And we'll start with a Gemini Vanguard carrier here. This one alongside the Fleet Gemini Vanguard support carrier, they are here at the top because they have the wingman mechanic. Technically, the Gemidar's attack ship frigates have a good DPS, but their AI is really bad. And so you're going to have lots of inconsistent stuff through runs. And personally, if I'm going to pick a hangar pet to give me damage, I want that damage to be consistent. And Gemidar attack ship frigates do not give me that consistency. And there's already enough variance anyways in runs that it's slightly infuriating if you're like, oh yeah, I had 4K less DPS because the AI on my pets happened to be bad that run. I mean, look, if you're going to have DPS frigates, I want them to be consistent. These ones are not. If Cryptic improves the AI of these things, then the Gemidar Vanguard ones would get boosted up. Because the attack ship frigates available if you have a tier 5 or tier 6 strike vessel or attack ship that isn't the starter ship for Gemidar captains and isn't the dilithium attack ship from the dilithium store. If you go to the shipyard, if you get any of the other tier 5 or tier 6 ones, then you unlock those attack ship frigates. That is where you get them from. Okay. If Cryptic buffs the AI on those, then they become decent options. Otherwise, just stick with the Gemidar's squadron pets or the Gemidar's support pets, frankly, to support pet frigates anyway. So when it comes to the two Gemidar versions, I would personally put the C-Store one a little bit higher than the other one because you have a lot of maneuverability on this thing, which is not that common for science carriers. And then if you add the console on top, you can add even more maneuverability on top of it too. So that maneuverability, in my opinion, puts this thing higher than the fleet variant, but they're still very, very comparable, frankly. And then after them, we get the Volkuv carrier and the Cation Aatrox carrier, which they both have the same issue. They have no good unique frigates. It would be cool if the old Burrell frigate pets that have like 100k HP actually, did good damage, but they don't. And I think thematically it would be appropriate for those to do good damage. Right now they don't. Cryptic, if you're listening, please buff those frigate pets because there's something that's super, super cool for the Volkuv carrier. It's what it's known for. Please make those frigate pets good. Cool. All right. As for the Cation Aatrox, nope. Like it's got really nothing going for it. Sure, it is the cat bus that Reddit calls it sometimes. But I mean, the downside of the starship is that a lot of its unique pets can't even be used on non-Cation starships. So it's like, not only do you have to have a platform that's not that great, but getting the starship doesn't even let you use the support carrier fund frigates for other carriers in the game either. So yes, it can use support carrier debuffing frigates, but so can other starships in the game. So this has to be towards the very bottom. That being said, I still consider those better than the Dauntless. This is our other science vessel in the game that has absolutely no flexible seating. But if we're following my rules in this video that you shouldn't be doing energy-based damage if you only have 6 weapon slots, this is the problem that this ship has. It's got 5 tactical abilities and it's got 6 science. So you can still do science on this thing. But do you really need 5 tactical abilities if you're just going to do a pure exotic build? Not really. If you want to do torpedo, this thing would have been better if the ship had even lieutenant command scene or something, but it's lieutenant intel. So I don't really see the point for this ship. If Cryptic wants the ship to actually be okay, I would say make it a science spearhead and give it an extra forward weapon. As it sits right now, I think this is the worst science vessel in the game. Of course, that is just my personal opinion on the matter. If you want to disagree with me with that, feel free. I will be happy to listen to your comments as to why this isn't the worst science vessel subclass starship inside the game. And of course, at the bottom of E tier is going to be the Vorkon carrier. This is the one that I moved into the science subclass stuff with my carrier reduced stuff in terms of redefining subclasses. I think it's a pretty terrible carrier. Any place that this ship would have ended up would have been towards the very bottom of any list, frankly. Being a science carrier basically with Commander Engineering isn't that great. Granted, it technically has the Dreadnought carrier mastery package. If you look over there on the right, though, the difference is that you're losing some of the resistance stuff to get energy and radiation damage resistance. So is it really that impactful? No. I'm going to be honest, it's not impactful. And especially whenever you're considering that this ship is below a 1.1 shield ratio, I actually would probably say for this particular starship, the flat damage distance is actually better than the actual shield resistance and shield regen, because the ratio is too low to actually matter for realistic survival. So with that said, what ship do I consider the abomination and the worst science vessel subclass starship, or science vessel starship in the entire game? Well, that would be the Jupiter carrier. The problems with this ship, you've got no unique frigates, especially when you consider the new support carrier stuff added to the game that had way higher hull and shields, and it had the better special seat. What you start to realize is not only is this ship not good, but its unique frigates also happen to be the worst frigates in the game. Now, technically speaking, there are some hangar pets that, based upon what they're doing, they don't do any damage. But when it comes to hangar pets, period, that do damage, the unique pets with the Jupiter carrier happen to be pretty much the worst DPS hangar pets, period. So if you're someone who wants to do Space Barbie and are using the Callisto frigates, like, I understand from the thematic standpoint. I understand, because the Jupiter carrier was a starship that we voted on for a design competition. It's so sad that this ship is just so terrible, and it actively hurts newer players too, because they think, oh yeah, this ship comes with cool frigates that look awesome but perform horribly. If Cryptic buffs the frigates, maybe I can push this thing out of F tier, but I don't really feel it. Technically, it has a unique console that gives your team 20% bonus all damage for 15 seconds, but you're sacrificing so much on this starship that I honestly can't even justify the unique console for the starship pushing it out of F tier. Some people probably disagree with me on that, but I think Jupiter is just so bad and it hurts players so much that are trying to play it for the thematic standpoint of using the Callisto frigates that, for me, it has to be here. And yeah, with that all said, that is the Science Vessels tier list that I have. Again, this is a subjective list. Obviously, you all may have different opinions than me on it. But I think, I've done an okay job doing this. I know that many people have different opinions on this. Some people will rank them just by the raw DPS, in which, yes, if you're just doing raw DPS on the absolute best platform for doing certain things, certain starships would go way, way higher. Like the Low-Wire Herc starship, the Fleet Titan would both go way, way higher on this list than what I have. But But when it comes to overall for trying to do just about every playstyle in the game, I think that the tier list that I've made here is a fair tier list. But yeah, feel free to say what you feel that I did wrong or incorrect in the comments. I will be making a like a much shorter like fourth video after the science one and the escort and the cruiser one comes out. Basically trying to go through a lot of what the common comments are from both the comment section as well as, you know, maybe things you disagree with and maybe to tell me on Twitter or people that give me super long emails saying like, you are wrong on every single thing and here's all like 200 reasons why. I read all those emails. I don't respond to them all, but I read all of them. So if you're really mad about something that I put in this video, feel free to let me know, whether that's comments, emails, whatever. And yeah, with that all said, until next time, keep in mind this was only just a couple hours just because we're only dealing with science vessels. And when it comes to science vessels, most of them are actually pretty decent because in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to science vessels, like it's really hard to go wrong with science vessels. Like, do you have 6 science abilities? Cool, then you're going to do decent damage. It might not be the spectacular game-breaking stuff, but you're going to still do decent damage and do okay in this game. You don't need specializations to do well on them. Like, if we were comparing like the 3 different classes, like if you had a starship that was completely science seeding and with a secondary deflector, or versus a cruiser with completely engineering seeding versus an escort with completely tactical seeding, the science vessel is going to win out. Like it's just the way that it is. And so when it comes to the classes, I think science vessels are fine. I wish that science carriers would actually get a boost, whether that's, you know, adding a starship trait that would let them have a secondary deflector, or something similar. I think is what they really need at this point in time. But besides science carriers, the rest of the science vessel subclasses are doing fine. I just wish we got more of them because there's more cool things to explore with them that we haven't explored yet inside of Star Trek Online. And I think if adding, think that could easily add a couple of new traits, especially new science destroyers, because those ones let people that want to do weapon damage still buy science vessels, but at the same time, it also still can appeal to people who want new science vessels in the game too. So hopefully they explore that route more and give us a science dreadnought in the near future because we've waited over 3 years for it. But with that being said, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later on this week.